It's about showing these horrible things that exist alongside beautiful things that exist as a way to not just say nature is beautiful, to acknowledge that those things exist and then start the dialogue of like, where do we go from here? I'm not out there to give solutions. We need to make artwork that makes people aware of the consequences for their actions, essentially.
Welcome. I'm Doug Cassina. I'm an artist, a gallerist, a curator, and a collector. And this is Artbound, where we deconstruct the myths and misconceptions of the art world. We have the conversations here with artists that aren't going to be found anywhere else. Well, thank you for joining us. And in this episode, we're diving into one of the oldest conversations that you can have around art, which is landscape. Today, I'm joined by Don Stenson, who is in his studio in Des Moines, Iowa. Hi, Don. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Doug.
And Gregory Euclid is joining us from St. Peters, Minnesota, in his barn studio, I believe.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into the subject of landscape, I want to tell you why I have these two guests with me. They're both artists who have informed my personal dialogue around landscape. Don Stenson is an artist who's represented by David B. Smith and Gerald Peters in Santa Fe. And he's a landscape painter who also is really exploring this conversation between culture and industry and the landscape as well. He has works in the Phoenix Art Museum, the Tucson Art Museum, the Denver Art Museum, and just recently did a residency in Cody, Wyoming, where hopefully he'll tell us some good stories about Kanye West. Also joining us, like I said, from his studio in Minnesota is Gregory Euclid. Gregory's an artist and a teacher. He's had exhibitions at Mass MoCA, a big installation at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. He's really well known also for doing the album cover for Bon Iver, which led to the development of his own record label called Thesis. So thank you guys again for joining me. And like I, indicated there, you both have had parts of your practice that have informed the way that I define what landscape is and how we speak about landscape kind of in a contemporary context. I guess this first question will be for you, Don. How do you see the role of landscape in contemporary art?
I just see it as an opportunity to really examine our lives and the spaces we are occupying and changing. So as a practice for me, it's just a matter of looking at things that puzzle me and then imagining how that can engage painting or a history of images, or painting, drawing. They just become a way for me to engage the history of photography, the history of landscape development, the history of national parks. Just a way to kind of question where we are.
Well, and Gregory, you incorporate a lot of non-traditional elements into your depiction of landscape, which is really fascinating to me because you use almost models that are pre-manufactured. I've seen recently you've been using plastic items that I think you found on the beaches of San Francisco. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about how medium has started to inform your depiction of the landscape?
So for me, like, landscape is something that I'm in frequently. It's land is what I'm in. And landscape is the act of trying to, through political means or through cultural means, like, define what land is. So when we think about like photography, you point that viewfinder toward an area and you say, this thing is important, and you say, this is the view. I'm always fascinated by like scenic turnouts, where, there's this giant mountain and there's this road going up the mountain. And then like they've cut out a section to have the road there and extend out over, the beautiful area. But then you look behind you and they dynamited the cliff away so that, like, it's just a clear cliff face there. And it's that kind of idea of, what does it mean to be in the land? So for me, similar to what, you were saying, is that, like, I want to explore this material, the natural world. And it always felt to me a little bit disingenuous to go home into the studio and then put this experience into a rectangle, a flat rectangle, because the world is so dynamic, the world is so textural. So I wanted to go out and start collecting things and introduce those things that I brought back from the land into my work. And the more I did that, the more I realized, like, I was being selective about what I collected. There's natural elements out in the land, but I was finding a ton of garbage and trash out there as well. And I had to, at some point, just be honest with myself and say, look, this is stuff that needs to be included in the work. Like, this is landscape today. Like, there's styrofoam everywhere. There's plastic bags everywhere. There's cigarette butts everywhere. So I started introducing all those materials into the work as a way to kind of, like, juxtapose these beautiful scenes with the reality that exists out there. And so I build all that diorama stuff myself, but I like to find things that are, not man-made, or are man-made, not things that should be in the land necessarily, like plastic bags or styrofoam, and then somehow incorporate them into the work to, recontextualize them and kind of play around with how you can juxtapose those materials, traditional landscape views with the garbage that we find out there.
Well, and I love that you're telling that narrative about kind of the introduction of man-made materials, not only through the medium, but into the narrative of the landscape itself. And for me, I think that's what's so exciting about having the two of you as guests, is that you're both telling this narrative in ways that I think is missing a lot of the time in traditional landscape painting. This tradition of landscape painting here in the West, at least, comes from like the Thomas Moran or the Bierstadt. And those guys all had kind of an objective to why they were painting. Several of them were hired by like the railroad companies to kind of bring forth this idea of, manifest destiny and travel west. And, there's always kind of an underpinning of some kind of objective in it.
Yeah,
and
like an advertisement.
Yeah, exactly. There was something to say. Like I look at the same thing with like Dutch still life, and back in the day, they used to add like little ears of corn, like to show how impressive their power was, that they've been able to travel overseas to the new world, and they brought back with them this ear of corn. And that was something that like became this status symbol. It was something that everybody would identify at the time as a narrative in the painting. I feel like that's still a really big part of how we speak to painting. But landscape can be a little more difficult, because it's how do you start telling those stories within the context of something that's not necessarily narrative. And both of you guys are doing such a fabulous job with this. I know Don, into his kind of Western landscape depictions, has had a lot of kind of follies of man, buildings that have been abandoned. Could you kind of describe how that came into your practice and where that's moving?
Well, I just got very interested in the failures and the things that aren't usually included in that rectangle of a painting, those established views. I was fascinated, Gregory, about what you were saying about the turnouts, the roadside. Here, look here. Mm-hmm. Don't look over here. Don't look at the cliff that's been blown away. So I started out thinking that it was important to slow people down, to really help them take time to look at a picture. I felt that photography had made us all fast lookers. And of course, as it's gotten more digital, we're all going at greater and greater speed. So painting is a great way to kind of slow look. It became apparent to me over time that most of the stuff that we're experiencing as we walk through the spaces of our lives aren't in paintings, aren't in photographs. People aren't even thinking to look at it. They can't pull up in their mind an image of a cigarette butt, an image of the plastic bottles. They have to be, fed it over and over again. And when you put something in the rectangle of a painting, you're giving it an elevated cultural status. And people start to go, oh, why is that art? Why is that important to look? So, that viewfinder or the what I chose became a really important kind of decision. And then I kept wanting to expand it. So these paintings got really long, and I started adding panels because I wanted it to be more and more inclusive. And there's no loss, or there's no absence of failures in the landscape of our nation. But what became interesting is these things started to reveal different stories to me over time. Often there was a great success, something really interesting, a technological innovation, like the spray gunite people would use for kidney-shaped pools in the 50s. All of a sudden those appear, and I started finding these old ones, and then the question became what happened and how to get those kind of stories out in a way that sort of suspended judgment and let people have the experience on their own terms became a lot of the problem for me, or a lot of the fun.
So what happened to those pools?
Well, one of my favorite pools is in south of Van Horn, Texas, kind of on the way to Marfa and Big Bend and all that. And it's had like several iterations, but I think initially what happened is an almond grove bought up the water rights and simply drained the town. And I thought, oh, that's a kind of a sad story. But a lot of the pools became abandoned, or if they were public pools, around the early 60s as it became mandated to integrate them. So, some of these stories are dark and important to tell.
How do you start telling these kind of narrative stories in landscape? I think that's a real kind of subtlety that I think the plein air type of artist may not really be picking up on. They obviously have this amazing reverence for the land. They're going out there hiking, setting up their easels and painting from life. But there might not be that kind of narrative that's attached with whatever reverence they might have. Have there been some ways, Gregory, that you've really kind of seen that help you integrate, kind of the narrative of environmentalism or other things that you've noticed artists doing well, or that you've really picked up in your individual practice?
Well, it's interesting because like land, it just is, right? Like trees are trees, rivers are rivers, and so on. And we prescribe meaning to them. We want to preserve land sometimes. You see the result of that kind of mindset playing out in wildfires and stuff like that, where we build a house next to it and then we want it to stay the same way it was. We tend to forget that sometimes land is man-made. So like the case of like Central Park, there's Central Park committees that like make sure you can't remove a single pine cone from the area, probably because there's so many people there and they don't want to deplete the resource, but also they look at that thing as nature, where actually it was man-made. They brought the boulders in, they filled in the space, they designed the entire space to look like nature, but it was Frederick Law Olmsted who built the place. And so sometimes like we have a really interesting relationship with land and how we want to interact with it. And that's why I said in the beginning, it's kind of political. You know, we decide what we want to do with land. So like even in Denver, there's is it the Arsenal or the Armory, or there's like a giant place where it's a park now, but it used to be, they buried a bunch of like chemicals, and I can't remember the entire story, but now it's like this beautiful park and everyone likes to go there, right? And it used to be this place where it was like no one could go. Do you know what I'm talking about there?
It was a place where they used to mine uranium for
Yeah,
trigger switches for nuclear bombs.
sure. So like
Yeah.
when I make work, I think when you're saying like the plein air painters, they go out and they look at something that they find beautiful or curious, or they find the colors are fascinating, or just the forms are fascinating. Or it's just grandiose, like you look at Thomas Cole or something like that, like, famous painting like the Oxbow, you look at that and you just go, wow, that's like a, beautiful scene, right? But we're kind of taught that that's beautiful. And I think people that go out and paint those things, they're responding to land in the same way that I respond to it, why I was drawn to landscape painting in the first place. Like, first of all, there's a curiosity for me. But then after that curiosity, I wonder, like, well, I think like Don was saying, like, the failures are interesting. And I would argue that like much of the landscape is a failure, because if you look at the problems that are going on right now, we have just mismanagement or misuse in general. But when I go out into the land, I'm first fascinated by it. I'm first finding it like extremely beautiful. And then I ask myself questions like, why am I finding this beautiful? What is it about it that makes it beautiful to me? Is it that I was taught that this is beautiful? Like, why is one thing more beautiful than another? Why do we preserve the Grand Canyon, but not preserve, grass fields? They both have an equal importance in the ecosystem. So we have a tendency to want to preserve these things that are like really grand and have a certain amount of like draw to them. The waterfall that's really huge, the canyon that's massive, the blah, 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 right? But when you understand ecology, like you were saying, you understand that some of the boring things are just as important, if not more important, than some of these things that we are really dead set on preserving. So, in my work, I'm trying to paint that beautiful stuff, the stuff that my mom would like. That's what I always say. My mom comes and she looks at my paintings and she goes, son, I really like that part. And it's, of course, the traditional nature scene. And then she goes, but why do you put all that other stuff in there? Like as if that's somehow ruining it for her. So she prefers nature as a construct that is beautiful, that is unaffected by man. And I think that's a very traditional way of looking at nature. I also prefer that because I've kind of been taught that, but I also know that like when Don was talking, I was like, you know what I would like to do? I would like to go to these scenic turnouts and just take a picture of what's on the ground just at the guardrail. Because at the guardrail, there's condoms, there's cigarette butts, there's Dorito bags, there's so much shit all around that scenic turnout that it's like fascinating to see. Like, someone came to the turnout, they got out of their car, they looked off across the landscape, they had a cigarette, and they're like, damn, that's beautiful, and then flicked their cigarette butt onto the ground right in front of them, and didn't think about the contrast or the weird irony of that. So those kind of areas are fascinating to me. And again, it's like, yes, that is beautiful out there. But also I find what's happening right at that guardrail also to be just as interesting and just as fascinating, and telling about our culture and telling about how we construct landscape or how we view landscape. So those kind of things creep their way really strongly, heavily into my work. Yeah.
I think that sounds like a really fabulous next series for you.
I was interested in, a lot of times they have these like weird viewfinders that look like little, aliens. You put the coin in and then you can look out. I wanted to do a series where I put those viewfinders that were actually, instead of viewfinders like telescopes, they were microscopes, and they were on the other side of the scenic turnout, facing the cliff that was dynamited away, so that you could put a coin in and look through the microscope at the cliff and get like a total converse view of the vista. You would get the microscopic. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point, because you're bringing up, what is it important that we look at in the landscape? How do we kind of define what's important in, painting? I think is also what type of conversation we're looking to have. And if we're just wanting to see the beauty in that landscape too, that's, I think, a very surface conversation to have, especially nowadays with looking at landscape. Don and I pre-podcast were talking a little bit about this idea of the sublime, of, this man versus nature, this understanding of, looking out into this vastness that's, either the ocean or this big landscape, with this kind of glimpse of hope of, as man, as, conqueror or whatever it might be. That's this manifest destiny, or something that's been built into the way that landscape, I think, here in the United States has been perceived. What are the important conversations that we should be having in a 21st century landscape painting?
You don't mind if I go first. My wife is a public policy mediator who worked in environment a lot. So I was constantly aware of these dialogues in government and partnerships with public-private people getting together and being very smart and just trying to organize effective guidance for the culture. Now, getting that to happen in government is challenging, but I was aware, holy cow, there's just really smart people all the time trying to figure out the best way to do this. And it's really hard to picture that process. It's really hard to elevate the process of coming to an effective compromise. When something is compromised, it's ruined. So that became a little project for me, just to think about how would I make, this a sense of a good solution, a good decision, dramatic and romantic on the scale of, sublime ruin. And I'm not sure I've gotten there, but I've given it a good shot every now and then, trying to dramatize that. And that's one of the things I like about your work, Gregory. I feel like the styrofoam supporting the different elements of traditional landscape is really a beautiful solution to bringing everything in.
Yeah, I think when we demonize things, we neglect the reason why those things are there. Right? Styrofoam exists for a reason, right? Like it's useful. Cell phones exist for a reason. Everyone wants a cell phone because they make our lives supposedly a little bit easier. You get in a car accident, you don't have to walk to a phone. You run out of something or you need something, you just text someone. But also then those minerals that are used in the batteries and in the cell phones, conflict minerals, they're mined somewhere. They come from the earth somewhere. And I think if you stop anyone on the street and say, hey, the minerals that are in your cell phone, the things that are required of the earth that are in your cell phone, not only damage the earth, but also the people who are doing the mining of those things are treated in a way that you would be appalled by. What would you do about it? And the people are going to be like, yeah, that's horrible, but I can't live without a cell phone. Right? And right there lies the problem. We've created a perceived ease. The straw, the styrofoam cup, the takeout container that's made out of styrofoam. We've created a perceived ease, but we've not shown the connection between or a consequence of how that thing then causes problems in the world. And even when we do show that consequence, like if I approach someone and say, look, the minerals in your cell phone are causing grave harm to someone else, does that bother you? they're going to say, yes, it bothers me, but I don't know what to do. And so, one of the things in my work, I like to show both sides. Like, the styrofoam isn't demonized in a sense. It's kind of just saying, like, look, this exists. But we need to kind of figure out ways in which we can solve the problem where we're not, because the petroleum industry isn't going away. So we have to say, like, okay, well, how can we make something smarter? How can we make incentives for the use of this or the recycling of this better? Like, I get myself into a conundrum every time I get a, yogurt container, because I eat the yogurt out of the container, and it's a plastic container, and then I have to, like, recycle it. But I also need to use hot water to wash the yogurt container out. And I'm like, okay, so I just used energy and soap to wash this container out. I frequently think about the amount of water, clean water, that I use to clean out my stuff that I would like to recycle. So there are these, like, real kind of, like, symbiotic problems that exist, I feel. And I don't know if scientists or the media is doing a really good job of educating everyone to the point where they say, like, yes, here is a solution. I have a friend of mine who went to grad school, and, I was complaining at home about kids not turning off the lights and stuff like that. And she said, you know what? You could save way more energy by putting a lid on your boiling water for the rest of the year than you would ever save by turning the lights off or on, after you leave the room. And so there are these, like, little tweaks, little hacks that we can do in our life that save the energy or affect the planet on a greater level than we could ever know. But, like, I just don't think everyone knows those things. So I don't know if someone's going to get that when they look at my work. But I think that for me, in my mind, I'm thinking about, there are these conflicts that exist between natural beauty and then the man, the man-made stuff that exists out there, or how man uses land. I'll often put open pit mines in my work, in the middle of this, like, beautiful scene. And, I can't say the open pit mine is bad, because, like, here I am benefiting from it. I'm sitting at a table that has steel on it, like all those things. So I just think that for me, in my work, it's about kind of showing these horrible things that exist alongside beautiful things that exist, as a way to not just say nature is beautiful, to acknowledge that those things exist, and then start the dialogue of, like, where do we go from here? I'm not out there to give solutions. I haven't spent my career studying those things, but I do think, like, we need to make artwork that makes people aware of the consequences for their actions, essentially.
Well, and I think you nailed it there. You're proposing questions, right? I think that's the beautiful thing about art, is it's an introduction to have a conversation. And the thing that I think both of you do so well is you use beauty to seduce the viewer into having those conversations. Because I think sometimes if you hit people over the head too directly with the messaging, they don't spend the time with the work to actually allow themselves to start analyzing and asking those questions of themselves about, okay, so why is the artist using this material? What am I looking at? How do I feel about what I'm seeing? Because they're like, okay, great, I get it, I'm walking on. So I really feel that's, for me, one of the most valuable tools that we have in contemporary artwork, is this ability to engage people to think. And I think that's where the change is really going to come from.
Yeah, and I think using, like, traditional beauty as a lure, that's the hook, is a really effective way, because you draw those people in who are probably most susceptible to thinking the way, like my mother. She's, she looks at that part of the painting and she's like, wow, that's really beautiful. And, then I'm also like, hey, Mom, why are you buying your milk from Quick Trip or whatever? There's a consequence to that, from a gas station instead of from a co-op or something like that,
So, Don, what are the conversations you're hoping people really want to have after looking at your work? What is the question that you're asking the viewer in the landscape?
I want them to go out into the world and just start looking differently. I want them to see something they haven't seen in a painting before, and go out in their lives and notice things that are there all the time, with a kind of deeper understanding or a desire for a deeper understanding. And I think the beauty as a lure works. What I've noticed is the more beautiful you make something that people regard as ugly, kind of the more shocking or the more pull it has on them. They're really sort of there's kind of a friction that happens, like, oh, I don't want to see that as beautiful. But once they do, they're rethinking their experience of it in their lives. So that's just a little change, but I really feel very happy when that happens. And the way I know is people will come back and tell me, oh my God, I've had one of these things, whatever it is. It's, of course, everybody has a gas station, but so many people will come back and say, oh, I saw a station I think you'll like. And I'll say, well, why do you think I'll like it? And then we have that conversation. Things like, and then I learned stuff. I mean, it never occurred to, I'm kind of fascinated by brownfields, landscapes that have been polluted and then brought back. Very hard to paint if they're successfully brought back. So it's right when they're in that kind of fallow phase, but before action has been taken, that they're really kind of pregnant with potential. So right when they're at their worst, you can see them as a possibility. And painting those areas that people want to overlook as possibility is just brings up all kinds of conversations for me in terms of the reception of the work.
And I think we've been kind of hinting around at one of the fundamental kind of dilemmas about talking about landscape, which is the environmental effect. The physical use of materials has been a way, I think, Gregory, that you're starting to introduce this into your work, also talking about strip mining, but also there's a lot of subtlety there with, as you were indicating, between what our stewardship ideas are versus our practical use and how we show up just being people. How do we talk about environmentalism in the landscape, and is there urgency to this? How do we approach this as artists?
So I'm just trying to think that when you were asking the question, I thought of someone, an artist, and I can't remember their name, but basically the idea is that the artist did not want to come out and say, this is what I want you to think. They wanted to leave something up to the viewer, so to speak. Otherwise, it becomes similar to that Manifest Destiny, that propaganda artwork. I do think there's something valuable about like saying, hey, look, man, the planet is kind of in danger and we need to do something about it. I just don't feel confident that I'm the person who's the one that's going to be able to say, this is what we need to do about it. I think there are people out there who are a lot smarter than I am that have the answers to it. What I think the biggest problem is what Don alluded to earlier, is that the political will, the people, the mass of public needs to say this is a problem and we need to do something to fix it. So it's just like, anything else, like gun violence, any one of these topics, there needs to be political will to fix these, to fix these problems. So I see my artwork as being simply by the fact that I'm a landscape painter, or simply by the fact that I'm engaging in landscape in a way that asks those questions. I'm doing a service to the quote unquote cause of environmentalism, because I'm saying this is important. Like every day I wake up, I do something pertaining to landscape. and I post it out there and I say, this is what I'm thinking about and so on. It's not that I say like, well, here's an alternative to selenium, which is a conflict mineral. Like I don't have that expertise, but what I do have is the ability to say, look, I've thought about land. I see these overarching problems, this systemic kind of issue with how we use land and how we interact with it. And I want you to be aware of it, because I think there's enough people out there who just don't think about it on a day-to-day basis that my artwork is an invitation to think about it.
I totally agree. I think art in general is there to pose questions, maybe not to offer solutions.
Agreed. I think it's, and then from it, the puzzle becomes how to make the questions open-ended, so people can come up with their own solutions. So there can be an open dialogue, and not like, I love this idea that you're not going to give the answer. You're going to ask a question that leads to further thinking, to further conversation, and kind of elevates the dialogue.
Well, and I've also heard, not just in maybe this issue, but in other issues in painting too, when you start getting into social justice or other aspects of, kind of that realm of dialogue where, people are like, I don't want to isolate my viewers. I don't want, a certain segment of the population to automatically dismiss what I'm doing as an artist because of their political views.
Yeah,
because those might be the people you want to talk to the most.
Yeah. That's interesting though, right? Because if your entire career is built upon preaching to the choir, so to speak, are you really having any effect? Yeah. I mean, a lot of nature lovers nature or land is a very interesting, topic, because you get into rural parts and there's people who love hunting, there's people who farm, and all of these things typically, the dialogue between city and rural inevitably comes up. But when you think about so I live out in a kind of a rural area now. I lived in Minneapolis for 10 years, and then we moved out to St. Peter, which is south about an hour. And lots of farming going on out here. And there's a lot of organic farmers. Well, the organic farmers all have to put signs up outside of their farm saying, don't spray here, because this county comes along and like any sumac or anything that's growing along the side of the road, they come by with chemicals and spray it. And so there's tension around this all the time. But like you were talking about the political differences, the one way to connect, or the one way I find that people do connect, is when they understand the benefit. So we had a governor in Minnesota who wanted to put a 50-foot buffer on the edge of every farm field, and man, they had to fight to get that into law. And the reason is to prevent all the runoff from, going into the rivers and streams of all these chemicals and stuff. So you put a buffer there and it slows down the runoff from going into your streams. Well, the moment they went into all the different rivers and lakes in Minnesota, which prides itself on nature, and tested and found all these chemicals in every one of the lakes and rivers and so on, then it was kind of like an epiphany moment for people. And they were like, whoa, maybe we should figure out a way to do this. But you got all these farmers who are going to lose 50 feet of land now all the way around. So what do? You have to pay them, you have to give them money to not farm that area. So this is kind of like those solutions that we're talking about. There's like maybe a right way to do things, or get people to form a consensus around something, but it's hard work. And it's hard to convince people like, yeah, we're going to give up land. I mean, we see this with the mask issue and so on in our society now. And it's like, even though you have facts that say like water droplets, cause this virus to happen, it's hard to convince people to go along with it. Yeah. So like, making artwork about landscape, like I said, I don't think I'm going to convince anyone to think a certain way, but just that idea of bringing up that question in their mind to think about it hopefully sparks some kind of dialogue.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's important to get that dialogue going. I've throughout this conversation, a couple of things have come up. One has been the Grand Canyon, and the other has been rural and city and the politics of different kinds of landscape. And something keeps popping in my mind that I just want to introduce. And this idea of wilderness or pure landscapes having more cultural status, where you see really wealthy people developing kind of private preserves near national parks or near wilderness, and there's a redemptive quality to this where you enact good conservation values and good stewardship, which is very important because it's helpful. But it becomes a kind of a cultural status element that is not available to everyone. And I'm wondering if I brought up the Grand Canyon because I'm reminded that when we were in the manifest destiny stage of things, and that it was an abyss. It was a horrible place that you couldn't farm. That was a real obstacle to getting to the coast. But over time, the railroad made it, and Thomas Moran made it this mystical land of wonder that we decided to preserve, rightly so. But that story of art transforming our vision, transforming our ideals, is one that I wish we heard more about when we're talking about conservation. And as a culture, we were more actively trying to transform how people want to live with the environment that they inhabit. So I feel good about making art, in my small way that does a little bit about that. But I wonder if either of you have any ideas about how, we could culturally make that kind of cultural transformation more the story and more the aspiration, rather than just only getting your perfect piece of nature and keeping it that way. How do we get everybody to want to make these radical transformation of vision? How would we make it bigger?
Through podcasting. Right? Isn't that what we're supposed to do?
Good answer.
No, that's what as a gallerist, that's what I'm like constantly asking myself, because I really truly see the magic of what art is and how it can show up in people's lives. But I think what it is we've become so engaged as a culture with just taking information in that we're not really having dialogue around anything anymore. We're just accepting kind of this stream that's given to us and fed to us, and we're not questioning. And so for me, it's how do we use art as a catalyst for having a conversation? And because art can show up as everything. It can show up as an environmental conversation. It can show up as social justice. It can show up as our idea around capitalism, or you name the subject matter, art can show up there. And it asks us those questions. So for me, it's how do we invite people in to have those conversations in a real sustainable way? How do we make art cool again is one of my questions that I'm always bringing up. How do we make thinking something of importance again? And because art is really only there to ask those questions, I think that's why it's so important that we have conversations like what we're doing right now to introduce the idea that the only reason why this exists is to have a conversation about what's coming up for you as a person when you're standing in front of this type of artwork.
Yeah. And I purposefully make my work three-dimensional, even though it's taken a decade or so to make it so that it can be constructed without falling apart, so that it can ship and so on. I purposefully make it three-dimensional so that people who actually are standing in front of it can have a relationship with their physical body with it. We are so removed from the physical world with our faces in our phones all the time, and like everything now, even more so, of course, because of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, I teach in a high school, and I would say 90% of the kids walking down the hall are just looking at their phones. You know, even if they're walking in a group, they're all walking in a group looking at individual phones. And so we experience the world through this flat screen. And I think there's something magical that happens when someone confronts a piece of artwork that's three-dimensional, that doesn't have a frame around it, that isn't protected. There's something that they're invited to explore in the same way they might if they went out on a walk in nature. Now, I always wanted to make a art exhibit that, you know, it was like my artwork on the wall, and then maybe it was the opening was you got to see the artwork, and then for the rest of the show it just said, get the fuck out of here and go to a park, you know. And it just invited people. I always liked that pop artist who said, my work is an invitation to look somewhere else. I think it was Rauschenberg. My work is an invitation to look somewhere else. And I thought, that's really beautiful, you know, like to have that humble approach like that. And I thought, well, if I'm a landscape artist, why are you in this gallery? You know, like go out, here's a brochure to go to a park, go experience, you know, nature or land firsthand. You know, I didn't ever actually do that project, but,
well, I love that for a title, first of all.
Yeah.
You know, that's up there with This Will Not Match Your Couch for show titles.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you've nailed it in a couple different ways. That's something as a curator and a gallerist I'm always thinking about, is how do you create the context for which people engage in art? How do you slow them down for a second so that they can really have that conversation? And adding that mixed media to your work creates a little bit more of that environment. And I think, Don, you do that the same way with scale in your work. You know, some of your pieces I've seen are 9 feet tall.
Yeah, I try to make it a physical experience and an immersive experience that reaches out around the viewer. There was a period of time, and the Denver Art Museum has one, where I would have sound included, where I would install elements from that place. If it's a drive-in movie theater, the speakers and then the sound of the grass, the sound of cars going by would bring it in. And I was always inspired to do that by Robert Adams, saying he wished he could have the sound of these places in his photographs. And so, you know, anything you can do to kind of make it immersive seemed like a really good idea. So I lately kind of like, I at first I loved the cell phones because of smartphones, because, you know, I found that all of a sudden everyone could understand, any kid could understand a 300-degree panorama. Whereas if you used to paint something like that, it was just so weird. It was like trying to teach people about analytical cubism. You know, they just didn't get it. How can I be looking all directions at once? And the concept of looking at a head turn now, an 8-year-old intrinsically, intuitively understands that. And the idea that you can change an image with your hand. I mean, before smartphones, you had to go to college and learn to draw before you got, I mean, people just didn't do that. They had sort of lost that hand-eye thought connection. We weren't doing it anymore. So I was glad about that. But now there's so many images, and the way it has to be formatted, the square has become incredibly important, so that you can flip through on Instagram. I find that it a little disturbing how we're being reformatted. So when, in these templates of online, bits, I think of going back to the beginning of this talk, of plein air painters. Now, I love direct observation. I think that's just such a powerful tool of learning. It's like the spoken word. It's that basic. So I often think everybody should have to learn to do that, to just make an image of what they're seeing, as part of education, especially in such a visual culture. But I find that what happens is most people learn a set of little templates, and then they just kind of piece together. And you could, I mean, Bob Ross was fascinating because you could watch him do the same tree and every different paintings in slightly different places. And it's that template that becomes the limit to our understanding. So anytime I see artwork that is taking a form and then extending it and asking further questions, I'm thrilled, and I just want to share more of that.
You bring up an interesting point, and I think this is something that we engaged with on a previous podcast talking about portraiture. There is this abundance of imagery nowadays where once upon a time landscape used to be a way of kind of capturing, a faraway place. Now we see so many images of everybody's travels photographs, everybody's backyard, everybody's tree in their backyard. We're just inundated with this imagery. How do you create something of importance that doesn't get lost within all of that?
I think about, initially when I started, I thought, photography's been so important. I want to use it in my artwork. I had a period where I only worked from life. And then I decided, no, it's just shaped so much of everyone's vision. I want to translate photography as well as what's in front of me. And a lot of what I used to make collages that were part of the paintings, and then add three-dimensional elements, all as a way of just integrating it, trying to make it a cohesive whole, this barrage of images. And now I think of it more as editorial. There's just such a flow, and I want to kind of make it make sense. I want to make it a coherent thought because it's just so overwhelming and ultimately confusing. I mean, I feel like it's analogous. This visual information is analogous to man and the landscape. We've become the sublime. We've become the avalanche that destroys things, and these images are the same way. It's we're all learning like haphazardly how to organize visual information. And I wish it was more conscious. And I think one of the things that artists do is make it a little more conscious, make it a little more aware, and say, you can really think about these things and it's worthwhile.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, why do people like your work? Why do people like my work? What is it about an artist that people need anymore? It used to be like you had a drawing room and you pulled out your pictures and you showed people, like, look, like, here's this thing. And now, like you said with Instagram, you get visually stimulated or fed images by the thousands, if you desire, by hundreds of different artists. And so what is it that people are drawn to? Sometimes I think about backwards designing the experience. Like, what do I want people to experience from my work? What is it I want? I mean, obviously we think about that, but like, on a conscious level, like, who is your audience? What do you want them to experience when they look at your work? And, I find that, I want people to have that kind of tactile, that in their body experience. I want them to be reminded of their body, by the fact that maybe they could break the piece if they get too close, by the fact that they're worried about, like, could that thing be broken? How is it protected? All these questions come up when you make a three-dimensional work. But yeah, I just think that that's a really good point that you made.
Well, what advice would you give to an artist who's starting to kind of find their voice in landscape on how to develop that further?
Yeah. Advice. Advice. I usually try to stay away from advice. Just because I know it's an individual journey for anyone. And it also depends on what you're what your take is. You know, obviously, if you're going to be a landscape painter or someone who deals with landscape, you have an appreciation for something within the natural world, and how you then formulate that to become your dialogue with your viewers, such a personal thing. I just know for myself, when I'm out looking at artwork, the things that interest me the most are the things that I don't quite understand in the beginning, you know? And so as an artist, if I can understand it, I go, I could probably do that. You know, like I didn't do it, of course, but like, you know, it's not like mystifying to me. It's not exciting to me. But when I see, I'm going to butcher his name, David MNJ, Canadian artist.
Sure.
Do you know who I'm talking? You know who I'm talking about? When I see his work with the mirrors and the plexiglass and the figures and like, you know, all these like crazy duplications of things within this, you know, giant installation, I just look at it and I go, okay, there's something I don't quite understand. It's like poetry. It's like something that I'm intrigued by. And so when it comes to,
I have that with Mark Bradford. I just am, it's so, I just feel so, it's so deeply felt for me. I just go, whoa. And it fascinates me. I could spend days.
yeah, I think that's the thing, is like it's this unique personal voice that's doing something in a way that really makes us pause. I know with music, it's the same thing for me. When I hear some music that I go, oh man, this is like, I don't know what this is. Usually a month later, it's my favorite thing, because it's so unique and it's taking the world and synthesizing it in such a unique way that my first listen, I'm shocked by it. And that's when I know someone is thinking out there about things in a way that is clearly unique and different. And I want to get to know that, you know? And I think that the same thing true for art. So like, if you're going to be a landscape painter, you know, I think that's kind of, for me anyways, that would be an important thing, to be making some work that when people look at it at first, which is hard, right? Because who wants to be that artist that no one understands or likes? No one, right? You want to be the artist that like people go, oh, that's cool. Like right off the bat, it's hard. But I think like, you know, that mystery in the work and that personal voice is probably one of the most important things to creating any work that's valuable.
Don?
Yes. I think that personal voice is really what animates anybody that does really good work. And it's, you know, it's hard to be aware of that when you're starting out, what it is. And I can remember trying really hard to come up with creative and original solutions to visual problems, and then slowly realize, you know, as I'm out in my life, that I have such an eccentric view. If I try to be really, really normal all the time, it's still going to look just really strange to people.
Did you have a moment where you realized like, this is the way I want to be making my work? Was there like an epiphany moment, or was it like a slow progression?
Well, there was an epiphany in terms of audience. I had been to school in Boston, moved to Seattle for a while, and then found myself back in Colorado where I grew up. And I had left there, and it felt a little bit like going back. I was moving to a mountain town, which is wonderful for most people, but there's often an absence of culture in little mountain ski towns. And it's not so much true now, but I mean, you know, we've had great strides made in Colorado, but when I went back, I felt it was just a really difficult move for me. And in terms of, is there enough money in art to make a living. I was making a good living in Seattle and Boston, and it was just kind of a struggle. And that struggle became the subject, and I started painting like where people who work in ski towns live, not where people go to stay for their vacation, but the trailer parks just outside of the main town, and all these kind of alternative landscapes. And I thought, no one's ever going to buy these, right? And then there turned out to be an audience for that, because everybody knew the Rocky Mountains weren't the Alps, even though all the advertising tried to make it look like that. And people were kind of hungry for that reality. And that was an epiphany, that if you paint what people are trying to understand, what they hope to resolve, then that can compel them. It was a great shock.
Yeah.
So maybe that was the moment. Thank you for that question.
Well, and I think that's some wonderful advice to anybody who's trying to find their voice, is to chase their natural curiosity and kind of see where that leads. Thank you both so much for joining me today. I feel like there's a lot more that we could speak to about the landscape and kind of the future of landscape painting as well. But that's all the time we have. So thank you, guys. It was really great having you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Gregory.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Artbound podcast. For more information about the guests and what we've discussed, go to artistnetwork.com/artbound. You can also find ways to connect with me and the Artbound team. We'd love to hear from you. If you've enjoyed the show, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen. Artbound is an Artist Network podcast and produced by Golden Peak Media. It's hosted by me, Doug Cassina. Our producer is Dacia Clay, with audio engineering by Evan Rutherford. Director of podcasts is Jared Mayer. Executive producer for Artist Network is Scott Meyer. Trisha Waddell is the director of content. Sarah Van Patter handles all our marketing, and Vanessa Childers does all things digital. If you'd like more information on sponsoring or advertising on Artbound, go to goldenpeakmedia.com. I'm Doug Cassina. Until next time.